Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today we're going to be doing another discussion video. And this is going to be on an interesting issue, a bit of an obscure issue, and a bit of a strange issue, which is that of tanks in Star Trek, in combat in Star Trek, and where do they fit in? Do they fit in? We don't see any, but that's because the show runners were cheap. Anyway, let's get on with it. So, first thing that I'm going to hear out of the gate, and I know people are going to say it, is there's no point in tanks when you can orbitally bombard the place, which is what people say every time. I've mentioned in my video on orbital bombardment why you can't just orbitally bombard for many reasons. There may be reasons why you either don't want to or you can't because of certain defenses. So that's why you deploy ground troops. And inevitably, when you're starting to deploy ground troops, you're going to be deploying cavalry and, well, not cavalry, but armoured additional fighting units of an armoured nature. So really the first thing to cover is, what are Star Trek tanks? Are they going to be tracked? Probably not. Are they going to be walkers? Almost certainly not. They are probably going to be hover, because it is the best design of sort of science fiction tanks. If we can, I'm very much treading on the toes of Spookston here. He's talked a lot about science fiction tanks, and basically we already do kind of have hover tanks in helicopter gunships. They are basically hover tanks. The only real difference is the lack of armor, but we can assume by the time of Star Trek, by the 23rd, 24th century, that's no longer an issue. You can have something that hovers and still has a good amount of protection and armor. So I'm really going to use as sort of the basis of my discussion these two designs by Shimmering Sword on DeviantArt, which he did as a commission. So the first one here is Federation tank. He calls it the SOM class, Surface Defense Escort. Good name. And he says that actually the main gun up there is a torpedo launcher. Now, I'm doubting that that's a full-size torpedo launcher, because that would make the tank enormous. I'm assuming it's more of a micro torpedo launcher, which is very good. I like the idea. Actually, when I was younger, watching the Next Generation films, I thought that the phaser rifles, because they fired in pulses, were actually photon rifles. But I do like I think that you definitely have to have a micro torpedo you'd have to be very careful with how powerful that thing is. But it makes sense, and I like the idea of it having a solid core ammunition. I'm sure there's issues with it. What else does he say? He also says it has several phaser arrays. Now, I can see one very clear one, which is this one on the top. I don't really like that as a phaser, having a phaser strip, because it's clearly sort of done on the scale of a full-size Starship phaser array. But part of the issue with that is, it's kind of a bit pointless. I would say what you'd actually have on a tank like this is you probably just have either a mini turret or a coax. Most likely a coax, because frankly, when you can turn the turret as fast as I'm sure this one can, I don't think you need additional phasers. That just requires more commanding from the gunner. Most modern main battle tanks have dispensed with the bow machine gun, and just fit a coax now, as well as the turret-mounted ones as well. So I don't really see why that wouldn't continue into that. Putting on additional phaser arrays just adds more additional demands to power, and when you've got a turret that can respond to threats, that should do anyway for most things. And again, I don't think you'd need that phaser strip on the turret. I think you'd actually have a more older style, sort of motion picture era, sort of round or turret. I don't think you need a whole strip there, because like I say, the turret can turn anyway. It's a bit different with starships where the phasers aren't on turrets that can turn, they're on strips, and there's certain advantages, but I think if you've got a maneuverable turret, there's no need for additional phaser strips. Now, he also says it has transporter arrays, so it has means of a transporter. I could see that being useful for escape, being able to escape the tank. Although, again, as I've said with fighters, you have to have somewhere to beam away to, which is not necessarily easy, particularly, as I say, with the reasons why ground combat will happen. One of them will be a transport inhibitor. If you've got a transport inhibitor, you can't transport out of there. They also have tractor beam emitters. Now that's kind of by the by, it's for towing or whatever, but I'll get onto that because that's, I think, interesting. It has all-round optical systems. I'm presuming they can basically see right through the tank for the crew, which is, again, kind of realistic, and that's something we're working towards in real life. And it's set, and finally Shimmering Sword says it has a pair of warp engines, and it can fly as a spacecraft at limited warp speeds. Now, I can see the visible warp engines, so it's a good look. I don't think it really makes sense for a tank, given that it is effectively a ground-bound, it is a short-range shuttle. Now, I think it's important to say, okay, how are you actually going to get... Because part of the issues of tanks in Star Trek is how do you get them onto the ground? I think they've just dropped down through the atmosphere like shuttles. I think getting back into orbit might be a different matter. I think they might have to have a ship come down, some kind of large shuttle or transport come down, to then take them back up to the ship. Crew layout, I can imagine this maybe being a 2 or even 3-man tank. So you'd look at a driver, commander, and a gunner. But I think you could maybe even dispense with the gunner, frankly. It's a very minimal crew layout. In terms of what it would probably be protected by, I'd say for most things you'd be looking at some kind of polarized hull plating. Shields are just not necessary against most of the threats you'll be coming up against on a planet's surface. When most of the threats are energy weapons, dispersive armor is perfectly fine. I don't think you need anything particularly heavier than that. In terms of where this doctrinally fits in or stylistically fits in, I think it very much fits in with the Dominion War, and that aesthetic is very much emblematic. But in terms of it being used in space, no, I don't really see it. I think it would be unnecessary to add a warp drive to it, and then you've got to make more accommodations for that. I think in reality it's just got to impulse nacelles. Now, how does it stay off the ground? How does it hover? I was thinking about that, and I was actually thinking about you would perhaps even use sort of an inverse tractor beam to create a hovering effect, something that pushes you off the ground rather than draws you towards it. They would actually use those tractor beam generators to actually maneuver itself, both sort of keeping itself off the ground, pushing off the ground, and then pulling itself towards other things. But in terms of, what about super tanks? What about super heavy tanks? All this kind of stuff. I think the key thing in Star Trek is this has to be, and I think looking at it, if it is the size I imagine that it is, it's no bigger than really a large shuttle. And I think that's important. I think basically you arrive in the planet, you launch all these from a shuttle base, they go in, they enter the planet's atmosphere and sort of stabilize around the surface, and then they're supporting the infantry and the like. But I don't think you could have anything necessarily bigger. The bigger it is, the more palaver that is involved in moving it to the point where it just becomes a planet-bound vehicle. I think the key thing with main battle tanks, and I think that's something that's kind of seen today, is you've got to have them kind of balance between, size and power and all that, and also it being feasible to move them around a lot. And I think this definitely is extremely feasible. Overall, I mean, I like the design, I like the look. I'll just quickly move on then to the Klingon design he also did. Which I think was very interesting. Yes, personally, I find this more reminiscent of the Klingons of Star Trek Enterprise, or even the kind of the JJ verse. I know that's heresy. Again, part of the thing that comes in is like, particularly with the Klingons, you've got birds of prey that can fly down. Maybe they could actually carry one of those in the aft loading ramp. I don't know. It looks like a 2-man tank. Just looking at, you can see there's a commander's hatch and a driver's hatch. I don't see there any reason for there to be more, because it's a tank destroyer, or it's a Sturmgeschütz or assault gun. The gun itself can't turn, which I think works for the Klingons. They like to keep their enemies in front of them, and then they want to mount the biggest, most powerful gun. It very much, I will say, this does look like a starship scale disruptor, like a bird of prey style disruptor cannon, which I think is excellent. And I think it kind of, the whole thing with Klingons, remember, they're all about attacking very quickly, very aggressively, and anything that's sort of a strong point, they're just going to smash through or bypass. So I'll just run through his description, which is that it's light, fast, and cheap. It's just enough armor to withstand light phaser fire, atmospheric entry, and sufficient shielding to take a single torpedo hit from a starship. I'm not so keen on that, because I can see it being... Why would you waste a torpedo on something that small? That I don't really understand. And you're not going to, again, for obvious reasons, you're not going to orbitally bombard where a ground battle's happening. You don't want to hit your ground troops, and photon torpedoes are very powerful. Its impulse engines offer extreme maneuverability and speed in atmospheric flight. That's very Klingon. They are less easily detected at long range than warp-based systems. Yep, I think that, again, I think that makes a lot more sense. It's simpler. You can pack one of these on board a bird of prey if every single Klingon bird of prey is carrying at least one. Let's not even mention the larger Klingon carriers that you have. A cloaking device makes up half the cost of the unit. That seems unnecessary. While I can imagine the Romulans maybe having some kind of cloaking device on their armoured fighting vehicles, I don't think a Klingon tank would. Klingons are not exactly subtle once they're on the ground, so I don't see the point in that. And again, cloaking devices are serious bits of kit. I don't think you'd waste it on a tank. It's like people say, oh, you could create a ship that you could... a cloaking device missile, a cloaking device anti-ship missile. And I'm like, yeah, but how expensive would that be? That would be ludicrously expensive. And you don't really get much use out of it. It's part of that thing of, like, do you want to create a weapon that's going to be more valuable than the thing it destroys? That's something we're coming into issues with tank-launched anti-tank missiles. They're frequently more expensive than the tanks they are actually destroying. So, what's really the point of it? It's armed with 5 weapons. Bird of prey derived anti-tank disruptor cannon. Thought so. Very good look. Chin-mounted heavy disruptor for ground attack. A photon mortar for close-in defense and non-line of sight attack. And 4 surface-to-space mid-sized photon torpedoes. And a sword wielded by an articulated arm. Very interesting description. I'm just looking at it. I can see the additional disruptor. I can also see the mortar launcher. I can see the surface launched torpedoes. Again, like I say, for that to be a genuine torpedo launcher, those would have to be huge. Those are not big enough, really, given the size of the commander and gunner's hatch. I don't think you could really say that those are full-size torpedoes. And again, I don't really see the point of being on the ground and then shooting at something in orbit as a sort of as vulnerable as this thing is. You're just inviting trouble. Having a mortar, I think that's very good, and I can see it sort of just behind the driver's or / gunner's hatch. I think that's very handy. I cannot see this sword articulated arm. I think it's tucked away, meant to be like tucked away on the left-hand side of the tank, or yeah, from how it would be if you were in the tank, it would be on the left-hand side. It looks tucked away. Why? I mean, I know the Klingons like, having swords and the like, but like I humour it because I kind of liked the Cleave ship from Discovery, which in itself is kind of heresy. But it is stupid. It's a stupid design. And I don't think you really need a actual sword-wielding tank. I think there's plenty of other things you could be using. Maybe giving it a sort of a battering ram, a sharpened battering ram, yes. But an actual articulated sword, it's a bit weird. But very imaginative, and I really liked, and this guy's a really great artist. Shimmering Sword. Anyway, so I mean that covers those two bits of art, and there are other potentials, but I haven't really seen much other artwork around for what could be Star Trek tanks and sort of what makes sense. But like I say, there's certain dictating principles which I think he doesn't necessarily take into account, which is that, you know, you're going to be deciding between a tank and a shuttle. There's pros and cons to both, but you kind of want them to fit into the same relative size bracket, and you want different capabilities. You don't need a tank to be warp capable. There's no point. You just pop it on the carrier, in a Kira or whatever, re-enter the planet's atmosphere. Maybe they can achieve escape velocity, or maybe they can't. But I definitely think they have to be of a reasonably small size and reasonably mobile, and otherwise they're going to be too big and just too easy a target. So I mean that's some of the things dictating Star Trek tanks. I think they really do face some of the issues that modern tanks face, and it's key. You've got to achieve that balance between capabilities, power, and all that, and also defenses and keeping the costs down. So those are just my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.